Okay, I will switch to the headset. Let's check that it's. I'm gonna change the. So is this better? Okay, perfect. Excellent.
Okay. Okay, so we'll wait a couple of seconds for people to get in. People are coming in. And then we'll start. Vamos a comenzar en algunos segundos más. Vamos a esperar que entren más personas. Muy bien. Entonces vamos a comenzar. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por unirse a este webinar. Que tenemos un invitado de lujo esta tarde. Quiero saludar a todos los profesores de la facultad, a los profesores de la universidad que se han unido, a los alumnos, a nuestros exalumnos que también hoy día nos están acompañando. Esto es parte de un ciclo de webinars que estamos teniendo como facultad con el tema de economía y constitución. Esto también es nuestra contribución al foro constitucional de la universidad. Tuvimos ya un primer webinar con Adam Chilton de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Chicago, y ahora tenemos el placer de contar con nosotros a Daron Acemoglu. Voy ahora a cambiarme a inglés brevemente para presentar a Daron. I will switch to English right now. It is my great honor to introduce Daron Acemoglu. Daron is currently, I would say, one of the, if not the one, leading economist in the world right now. Is undoubtedly someone that is pushing really the frontier of how we think in economics. His CV is absolutely impressive. I won't summarize it because I would take the whole time, and it's not the idea. But I would say some things about his CV. He's an institute professor at the Department of Economics at MIT. In 2005, he received the John Bates Clark Medal Award, which is given to economists under age 40, judged to have made the most significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. He has over nearly 160 papers in refereed journals and the best journals possible, and over 47 chapters in books and conference volumes. He's also the author with Jim Robinson of the bestseller Why Nations Fails, which was published in 2012. And recently in 2019, The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty, published by Penguin Press, which he presented last March in 2020 in our auditorium. We were remembering with Daron before we started that this was our last massive event in presentiality in our auditorium in March 5th in 2020 before, and that same weekend we went into lockdown here in Chile. Today we thank you very much, Daron, for joining us. We hope to have you here in presence in the near future. Thank you very much for sharing with us your thoughts about the importance of institutions to foster inclusive development in a modern, free, and democratic society. Now, I will give you the floor. You will have between 30 and 35 minutes to talk, and then Jan Lafortune, which I will present now. Jan Lafortune is professor here at the Institute of Economics from our Faculty of Business and Economics. She will moderate the Q&A, and which will be right after your presentation. Thank you very much, Daron, and you have your time now.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose Miguel. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and of course, for the invitation. So it's my pleasure to be back in Santiago, except that it's not in person, and in person is more fun, but still Zoom provides us with a lot of opportunities. So last time, which was my last trip for 18 months, I talked about the narrow corridor. So I'm going to talk about the same theme, but more targeted to issues of constitutions and justice. So the title of my talk is Building Better Institutions for the 21st Century, Lessons from the Narrow Corridor. And of course, I'm going to focus on Latin America and Chile especially, but also make it a little broader. And this is the Spanish translation of the book with a very nice cover. So I thought I'd show that as well. So the question, as I see it, is partly how to move away from this. This, of course, you recognize is the 18th century La Castas, the casta paintings. That is a symbol of the highly hierarchical nature of Spanish colonial societies, which to a large extent continued after independence in much of Latin America, even if the racial basis was not as explicit. The castas was, I think, very salient, both in terms of enshrining this hierarchical nature of society and that it was a racially based hierarchical society. And how to move away from this, because I think this is inconsistent with two of the things that many humans, especially in the 21st century, but actually in the narrow corridor, we argue throughout human history, have desired, which is justice and social participation. So how to move away from this to some semblance of justice and some type of political participation, which of course today is embedded in democratic institutions. I think we could spend several hours talking about what really this is, what is the type of participatory institutions that we desire. But I think most people probably have better idea about this than this, what we really mean by justice. What is justice? And I think that's really an important part of any type of discussion concerning what type of constitutions, what type of political system, and what type of economic system we want. I'm an economist by training, and most of my work is in economics, but a lot of my work actually emphasizes the importance of institutional features related to justice, related to political participation. And in fact, I'm going to not talk about economics much today, because I think these fundamental issues are somewhat more relevant to the current moment in Chile and Latin America. So there's no broad agreed definition of justice. So let's start with one. And I'll start with Philip Pettit, a Princeton philosopher, and his definition of dominance. So essentially by dominance, he means a very unequal power relation. So dominance is, according to Pettit, to live at the mercy of another, having to live in a manner that leaves you vulnerable to some ill that the other is in a position to arbitrarily impose. Subject to arbitrary sway, being subject to the potentially capricious will or the potentially idiosyncratic judgment of another. So if you accept this definition, which of course is, one possible definition, and some people may articulate the problem of justice differently, but it is clear that according to this definition, something like the Las Castas hierarchy is inimical to justice. It is the zenith of dominance. So the power relations are so unequal and so hierarchical that they will not allow any other type of social relation than Philip Pettit's dominance. And the most basic tenet of justice, which I think is the essence of liberty, and that's the sense of liberty that we use in the book, is this lack of dominance. So you need to weaken relations of dominance in order to a basic form of liberty to emerge. This requires lack of violence or the threat of violence, but it also requires broadly based, broadly distributed opportunities and the breakdown of all caste systems. So I want to draw your attention to this broadly distributed opportunities. Pettit is non-committal on this to some extent, but I think if you take his definition, and he does in later writings, for example, huge amounts of economic inequities would also be a type of dominance. So if I am an employer that can arbitrarily or because of my idiosyncratic judgment fire you, and you have no ability to obtain other comparable employment opportunities, that would be a form of dominance, because I would have a lot of power over you. But even more broadly, if there are no economic opportunities and the only thing you can do is, live in abject poverty, that is a form of dominance as well. Now, the society that empowers certain groups is creating a type of dominance on those who don't have the opportunities to look after their own economic well-being or families. So therefore, liberty here, and this is the sense in which we use the word in the book, goes beyond the very narrow sort of classical liberty notion, the ability to be let alone by the government. It also comes with opportunities to break these types of dominance cycles. And the reason I want to emphasize this is because I think it has relevance both for the Chilean context, but also more broadly for Latin America and the world, because I think there are two broad sets of challenges that the entire world, and in particular Chile, is facing in the context of achieving some semblance of non-dominance, some semblance of liberty. One is economic inequality is very steep in many parts of the world. So this is share of the national income captured by the top 1%. And in many places in Latin America, including Chile, it's very, very high, above 20%, such as in Russia and a few Asian countries as well. And this type of inequality inevitably comes with hierarchy. The US is less than that, still very high. And you can see that already in the US, that as inequality has increased, the hierarchical nature of society has heightened. Inequality has been high in Chile historically, and has been high in Latin America historically. So this is data from Ferreira and Schoch, showing the evolution of inequality according to one measure. I think there is some disagreement about what's the right measure, what the exact time path, but I think the broad outline is that many countries in Latin America started very high, and many countries, this is in terms of Gini, very high levels of Gini, above 45, 50%. 50%, 0.5. And many of them have had declining inequalities in the late 1990s and especially early 2000s onwards. So in this context, you see Chile was not the most unequal country in Latin America, but very unequal by world standards. And it has followed the Latin American trends by and large, not as fast as Argentina, but pretty much comparable to other countries. But there is nothing exceptional in terms of the fall in Chilean inequality during this era. And still at the end, it's still high, according to the Ferreira-Schoch data, 0.46, which is still a very high Gini. And this is also not out of line with historical Chilean inequality, although comparing Gini to 100 years ago is very difficult because economic structure has changed so much. I think worse than economic inequality, and perhaps in the minds of many, not improving as much as economic inequality does, undergirding some of the discontent, is that there is a lot of hierarchy of social status, which again very much dovetails with notions of dominance a la Petit. This consists of issues like who has access to good jobs. If you look at the boardrooms of the leading companies, what is the social background of the people you meet there? Who has access to political power? Who has access to good education? And who has access to voice? Because, societal voice, whose concerns are heard, is not different from this, because who the journalists are and who the journalists listen to is very connected to who has political power, who has good education. In this sense, some of the numbers in Chile are, mind-boggling. If you look at the backgrounds of the cabinet members of Sebastián Piñera's 2010 government, 86% come from private schools. The business elite, the CEOs of top 100 firms in Chile, according to the data, 86% come from private schools. So those are, mind-boggling numbers. They have improved over the last 10 years, but they're still very, very high. And in fact, there's also some evidence, although some contested evidence, that access to protection and vaccine against coronavirus is also correlated with social status, economic background. But it's actually, interestingly, this is not true. It doesn't seem to be true in the Santiago area, which I'll link to state capacity in a second. So state capacity actually is a double-edged sword, as I'm going to try to articulate. I mean, it might be one of the ways in which we have to think about how to combat various dimensions of inequality and social hierarchy, but it's a very dangerous double-edged sword, as I'll come back to at the end. The inequality problems are not confined to Chile, and in fact, global inequality trends should be very concerning to Chileans, because Chile is still in the midst of trying to reduce historically very high inequality trends that had already increased in the 70s and 80s, and trying to reduce them. But the world is going in a different way and creating a broad trends towards greater inequality. This is the US. I'm showing the real wages for men, similar for women. And you see that after having a broadly shared prosperity period where different education groups, for example, increased their wages more or less in tandem in the 50s and the 60s, there has been a huge explosion in wage inequality in the US. And those with low education, these are high school dropouts, these are high school graduates, these are workers with 2 years of college, have had significant declines in their real wages. And this is very relevant, in my opinion, for two reasons. First of all, sure, what I showed you before, the top 1% or top 0.1% wealth or income share is very important, it's very visible, very salient, very symbolic. But for most people, even more important are the labor market opportunities. But second, whatever happens in the US, I think is a bellwether of what will happen in the emerging world later, because this is showing both the institutional power and the demand for low-skilled workers being eroded, which is then being translated to the rest of the world. It's not unrelated to new technologies such as automation. It's not unrelated to the role of China, for example, and also capital mobility. And just to highlight that this is not a US phenomenon, not just a US phenomenon. If you look at what's going on with the occupations that make up the bulk of the middle class in the industrialized world, the middle paying third of occupations, blue collar jobs, clerical jobs, sales, retail, back office functions, and so on, they have all been contracting across the OECD. And again, this is a bellwether of the sort of trends that are going to face the emerging world. So the inequality problem, and together with it the social hierarchy problem that is already very severe, will face additional challenges. So this is the right time for many countries in Latin America to start thinking about what types of institutions we want to have for dealing with these future challenges. But therein comes the second challenge. The best institutions for dealing with all of these problems, in my mind, according to my research and according to both econometric and historical research that I have done, and some of it we can talk about later, is democratic institutions. Latin Americans probably don't need to be reminded that deviations from democracy have come at great cost, and any benefits that were promised from such changes were elusive often. But the problem is that after Francis Fukuyama predicted the end of history and unabashed victory of political and economic liberalism anywhere around the world after the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, and after about 15 years of rapid spread of democratic institutions everywhere, including in Latin America, we now see the opposite. Over the last 16 years, every year, according to Freedom House, we've had more countries move away from democracy or weaken their democratic institutions. There are many reasons for this, but one of them that is, or two of them that are captured in this picture are China and technology. Technological changes, including AI, facial recognition, internet controls, and so on, have strengthened dictatorial regimes, and China's rise as an economic and global power has given an additional boost to non-democratic regimes. It is not an uncommon occurrence for me to go to any country around the world over the last 5-6 years and people telling me, but China has proved that democratic institutions don't work and we need strong leadership, meaning an autocrat. So those trends are influencing Latin America as well, as you see from the case of Brazil, for example, which again does not seem to be a very great poster child for non-democratic authoritarian presidents, but so be it. And this shows perhaps what will be more common, the social credit system in China, which has already been implemented in many provinces, but it will become more and more common around the world, most likely, as governments are able to control and collect more data about their citizens. And in this context, of course, the coronavirus crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has created an additional boost for many of these challenges, as many people recognize rightly that during such period, it's important for the government to collect more data or even regulate people's behavior in terms of vaccinations, mask wearing, social distancing, and also have more interventions in the economy. But all of these are also shifting the balance between state and society. These issues are as old as history. In fact, the topics that I'm talking about are the subject matter of the earliest surviving writing among humans. The Sumerian tablets from the Sumerian city-state of Uruk, from 4,200 years ago. They tell the story of the mythical king Gilgamesh. And the tablets start telling what a wonderful city Uruk is under Gilgamesh's rule, how its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun, and wonderful infrastructure, wonderful trade opportunities, shops, marketplaces, houses, the public squares. But a little later, it becomes immediately clear that there's a fly in the ointment. And it is what I would call the hitch of despotism. The tablets continue, who is like Gilgamesh? What other king has inspired such awe? I alone rule supreme among mankind. Trampling its citizens like a wild bull. He is king, he does whatever he wants. Takes the son from his father, crushes him, takes the girl from her mother and uses her. No one dares to oppose him. So if you read this passage, you cannot be but struck that they are worried about dominance. It is a particular kind of dominance, despotism, which comes with the power of the state or those who control the tools of the state, institutions, violence, other state tools. Now, this is an amazing document. Not only it identifies what has been central for my work, but the work of many, many other social scientists, but it also comes up with a solution. It is the first solution. And according to some thinkers, it's actually a perfect solution, but I will argue it's an imperfect solution. The citizens cry out to the heaven, to the god of the sky, Anu, to stop this despotism. And Anu comes up with a solution to contain Gilgamesh. the doppelganger solution, create a double for Gilgamesh, his second self, a man who equals his strength and courage, a man who equals his stormy heart, creates a new hero, let them balance each other perfectly so that Uruk has peace. So you will recognize this, not so different the way that American founding fathers such as Madison, Montesquieu, before them, of course, and many people today think. Checks and balances. Enkidu, Gilgamesh's double, will be a different center of power, and the two are going to balance each other. Alas, things are not so simple. Yes, Enkidu at first beats Gilgamesh or stops him, but who will control Enkidu? What about the two gods fighting each other? Well, worse. It turns out that soon, later in the epic, they gang up together and they start fighting others. So who will prevent the checks and balances turning into centralized power, especially on the most important issues? So hence, this is an imperfect solution. And the reason why it's imperfect is exactly the thing that Anu and the founding father of the US came up with, but it's, I think, quite problematic. It does not involve the active participation of citizens. So the way that Jim and I articulate the problem is that what you need is, you need a strong state. The reason why things worked out better with vaccine distribution, vaccination in the Santiago area is the greater state capacity. If you look at inequality reductions, in many cases in the European context, state redistribution programs and other legislations, as well as opportunities via education, infrastructure, and so on, have played an important role. But that strong state, it will act like Gilgamesh. So who will stop that Leviathan from being a sea monster that devours all? So the idea is to have a shackled Leviathan, but that shackling needs to be done by society, not just by some checks and balances. And I'll come back why this is so important in the context of the constitutions, this debate. So schematically, this is the summary of our argument. Reducing everything quite significantly, you can think of societies being distinguished by how much power and capacity the state has, and how much power, especially the power to collectively organize, be engaged in politics, and counter elites and states, how much of that power society has. China, for example, today, as many societies throughout history, are an example of a despotic Leviathan where the state has too much power relative to society. And you see that's a divergent dynamic. That's what these arrows are supposed to represent. Once you are there, you go further and further away because the state starts extinguishing any societal participation, as we are seeing with the little civil society that had emerged in the 1990s being completely suppressed in China today. But the other configuration, the polar configuration, is not much better. If state is too weak, then you have the collapse of state institutions, which creates a lot of other problems. Things are much better for liberty, justice, democratic participation, and actually for some aspects of economic innovation, but I'm not going to get into that, inside what we call the narrow corridor. Inside that corridor, state and society are balanced. Neither dominates the other. And as a result, you see a very different dynamic. And this is a dynamic that we call the Red Queen effect. Just like in Alice in Wonderland, both sides of this have to run as fast as they can to keep up with the other. When the state becomes stronger in terms of capacity, when the elites become in charge of bigger, more complex businesses, society needs to run stronger in terms of increasing the strength and the depth of democratic institutions in order to be able to check them. And it is that Red Queen effect that makes these arrows go in a very different direction, co-evolving in such a way that both state and society simultaneously become stronger. I'll say one more word on that in the next slide, but before I go there, let me emphasize one other thing. Being in the corridor is a process. That's one of the main ideas that we also wanted to communicate in the book. You know, when you enter the corridor here or here or here, you don't have great state capacity, you don't have much participation. Over time, these things have to develop. It's a slow, painful, sometimes risky process, again, as Chilean history demonstrates. There is nothing better in my mind that captures the essence of the corridor than this. This is from ancient Greece, ancient Athens, 2,400 years ago. And it is a symbol of what the Greeks were trying to achieve at a time when they had unrivaled state institutions being built in ancient Athens, for example, nothing comparable to what had gone before in terms of social security system, monetary system, roads, land reform, circuit court judges, orphanages, and so on. But at the same time, they were very concerned about checking the power of the state and the power of the elites. And one of the tools that they came up with was this law, the ostracism law. Every year, the assembly, where all male Athenians would take part, excluded slaves and excluded women, but still for its time was fairly participatory, would decide whether there should be an ostracism. And if there was an ostracism, they would write the name of somebody on a piece of broken shards of pottery, and which is called ostrakon, and that's where the word ostracism comes from. And then whoever's name appears most would be banished from the city, exiled for 10 years. And this one is Themistocles, the greatest hero that Athens has had, saved Athens against Persians and then almost saved them against Spartans. But at some point, people thought he was getting too powerful, too big for his britches, and they exiled him from the city. So this is the essence of the argument, that this Red Queen effect really creates a contested power of the state. But in some ways, and contrary to what many political scientists such as Huntington and his followers think, this is better than uncontested power. True state capacity doesn't come when you have a state that is too powerful to do whatever it wants, like in China, but it comes when state power is contested because it interacts, exchanges information, and over time builds more trust with society. What does that all mean for history, and what does it mean for Chile today? Well, for history, it says that perhaps we should rethink where state capacity comes from. The most common ways in which social scientists and historians and commentators have thought about state capacity is that it is something that's created by sometimes episodic structural changes, nature of technology, such as Marx argued, some geographies, some special circumstances. Perhaps Chile had a very different place in the Spanish Empire, and that's why it developed the state capacity that, say, Brazil or Mexico didn't. All of these are valid, but they are insufficient. So to do that, let me take this one here, war or threat of war, which is perhaps the most common one, the most popular one among political scientists and sociologists. It goes back to the famous political sociologist Charles Tilly, who argued states made war and war made the state, that war making was the crucial element that built state capacity. But in fact, this framework shows why there are as many counterexamples for Tilly's claims as there are examples supporting it. So true state capacity requires being in the corridor. War and other shocks like that, you can think of it as increasing or necessitating an autonomous increase in the power of the state. But that really depends, or its implications depend on where you are. So Montenegro, for example, throughout the 500 years following 15th century, was engaged in wars with the Ottomans and with other powers, but it was so far from any type of functioning state institutions that didn't really change anything. Switzerland is a great example of the threat of war from the Holy Roman Empire, bringing the cantons together and bringing a very different political dynamic and putting Switzerland into the corridor. But then Prussia shows the danger. If you increase the power of the state without countervailing powers, as what happened after the 30-year war in Prussia, that can actually take you out of the corridor. The state became too strong, both economically and socially, huge conscription system, huge restructuring of agriculture, control of the state, abolishing of the parliaments, and so on. So this also highlights that there are multiple paths of entering the corridor. It depends on where you are. If you have weak state institutions, strengthening them is critical, like the Switzerland example. But if you start with too strong state institutions and society is too weak, then what you need is actually strengthening of societies, democratic participation, civil action, protests, and media and such things. Or perhaps if you are below here, you may need to have both of them strengthening at the same time. Now, the reason why I've gone through this is that I want to say a few words about where Chile fits in, and then link this to issues of constitutions, and then conclude with some final thoughts. So first of all, in my mind, Chile fits into this picture as already in the corridor, but not firmly so, meaning that elites and states are still too strong, making Chile's existence in the corridor still not as stable and fruitful as it could be. And thinking of its history, I think, is instructive here. I think you cannot think of Chile being in the corridor before the late 1950s, early 1960s, even though there were elections. Those were not free and fair, and the oligarchic basis of power was just too overwhelming. It was the breakdown of these oligarchic roots of political power that, of course, started the unstable process of new coalitions forming, new political promises from Christian Democrats and liberals, and of course communists or socialists. That all was the mixture, potentially dangerous mixture, of the 1960s and the early 70s. And obviously you cannot think of Chile being in the corridor after Pinochet's coup, but by the standards of Latin American dictatorships, there was a relatively smooth end to the Pinochet's dictatorship, and Chile entered the corridor with a redemocratization, but still not combating this problem of states and elites being too strong. And it's not just the 1973 coup's aftershocks, but it's because the enduring social hierarchy that I referred to at the beginning. So therefore, in this thinking, Chile is here, it has entered the corridor with democratization, but it's still too close to the boundary for the true Red Queen effects to gain the power that they do. And in this age of currents against democratization, inequality dynamics becoming more complex, and aspirations increasing with a world which has culturally and informationally globalized, I think this is still a work in progress. And in this context, why and how do constitutions matter? I have argued that liberty isn't protected by constitutions. Why is a new constitution so important to many Chileans? I think in my mind, this has to be understood as both an aspiration and a symbol. You know, of course, as an outsider reading, is that Chile is still a two-tiered society and is trying to break out of that. So a new constitution is a symbol of greater recognition that this has to change and give sufficient voice, additional voice, to those who have felt so far not well represented in this hierarchy, not to have voice. And if so, the process of writing and ratifying the constitution matters greatly. So it's not just that you want to have an ideal constitution, whatever that is, and however unreasonable that is, but a constitution that plucked from the top is not the same one as the same provisions, but coming up from a decentralized process in which people have voice. So the process of writing and ratifying matters greatly. And in fact, this is not unique to Chile. I think the Chilean context amplifies it, but it's not unique to Chile. Constitutions are always most powerful and most transformative politically when they are a credible commitment device that amplify the trust in institutions and the channels of communication. And therefore, I think Chile is going through a difficult, but at some level, very valuable process of diverse set of voices being heard in this constitution writing process. And it is part of this social mobilization that I see as still needs to go on further of increasing the power of society against the state institutions and against elites, but hopefully without damaging those state institutions. And I want to end here with one final thought. What about the concerns that this gentleman expressed? Friedrich von Hayek, one of the greatest social scientists of the 20th century, and what he was worried about was that the drive towards welfare states, which were of course very important for the 20th century, second half of the 20th century in the Western world, would actually bring a second serfdom, a new totalitarianism. He was an emigre in my alma mater, the London School of Economics, and when the Beveridge Report came out in 1942, he was incensed. Well, the Beveridge Report was the blueprint for the welfare state. It was electrifying for the British population, and it was amazingly modern and amazingly far-reaching as really an inspiring document. And most people perceived it so. But Hayek was alarmed because he thought that this was, by introducing so much power in the hands of the state, it was going to bring this new totalitarianism. So he said, this means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. And perhaps those are not completely irrelevant in the age of COVID-19 and when we are thinking of constitutions that will increase more rights and require bigger welfare state, bigger power of the state in providing opportunities, providing infrastructure, providing protection against the people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy. But at the end, in the 1940s and thereafter, Hayek turned out not to be right. His concern was that Western societies will spin out of the corridor, but instead we got the Red Queen effect, and they continued in the corridor with the power of the state increasing, but at the same time, the power of society, democratic participation, free media, protests, civil societies, non-governmental organizations becoming more powerful. We saw this even before Hayek wrote, first in Sweden and Norway, then in Europe, US, and even Japan. What was critical was that truly there was this broad participation. And even though there were ideological differences between left and right, it did not become a polarized world of the sort that what we saw, for example, in the early 1970s and late 1960s in Chile. And that was really created the opportunity for societal participation to increase. And I think that is an aspiration that's still feasible, but it requires this balance of power. So any new constitution has the danger that it can upset balance of powers and empower some groups at the expense of others and make this existence in the corridor infeasible. So I think a new process of bottom-up constitution writing holds great promise, but this balance of power imperative is true and very important for people to remember. A constitution has to be a template for being in the corridor and cooperating and checking the power of elites and states, but at the same time, enabling different interests to survive and have voice. And I think that is what holds the promise. But of course, we have to worry about the things that Hayek himself worried about so that we can avoid them again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daron. some of you may not know, but I feel like I'm back in the classroom a couple of, we're not going to mention how many years ago, listening to.
Sorry for it if it's too traumatic, Jean.
No, it's actually very pleasant, very nice memories. And so I will take questions on the Q&A. So if attendees want to send them, si prefieren hacerla en español, yo la puedo leer y después traducir, no hay problema con eso. So the first question that came up was about Chile being a extractive or inclusive society. Maybe, give an idea of whether the role of extractive industries play a role in this process. What do we know in this topic?
Thank you, Jean. I think the way that I would, the way that James and I define extractive institutions, extractive societies, and why nations fail is related to extractive industries, but it's beyond that. It's a society that's organized around the power of an elite and economic institutions that sort of empower that elite, create advantages for that elite at the expense of the rest of society. Extractive societies a la mining in the Mita or the colonial Latin America are, of course, examples of this, but they go beyond that. So in that sense, I would say Chile was certainly an extractive society for most of the 20th century, both because of its economic structure and because of its political and social status structure that I highlighted. And I see the reforms that started in the 1960s as a process of moving away from these extractive institutions, which was, of course, a very painful process and a very difficult process. And the coup has to be, the Pinochet's coup has to be understood in that context. So I think today, I would say, or since the late 1990s or mid 1990s, I would say Chile is in the process of becoming more inclusive, but for exactly the same reasons that I tried to mention briefly during the talk. I think it is work in progress, meaning that you cannot have a truly inclusive society if economic opportunities remain very unequally distributed. So if all of the good positions in politics, business, and other highly desired professions go to a small fraction of the population, that is a telltale sign that something is not truly inclusive. There is nothing that would naturally say that sort of 5% of the population should command the vast majority of all the highest position in society.
Thank you very much. I'll try to paraphrase some of the questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A. Sorry for any inaccuracies to the people who have read it. Sebastián Claro is asking a bit, are there different ways in which you can increase power for both the state and society that would be good or bad? For example, stronger rule-based state or increasing the arbitrary role for the state. How can we think of this?
Wonderful question. Thank you. That's a great question. Yes, indeed. So the figure and the discussion surrounding the figure were quite important major abstractions, because state power doesn't come in a single form. There is a bundle of state power. They are mutually reinforcing, but they are quite distinct. So the police power of the state, which is its ability to control violence and use threat of violence to impose its rule or certain modes of behavior, is much more likely to be despotic and extractive unless controlled, than some other types of power. For instance, if you look at the power of the state, that sometimes, you know, is similar to what the sociologist Michael Mann calls infrastructural power of the state, its ability to be around everywhere in the country and provide basic rules of the state, bureaucracy, public services, notaries, etc. That's much more likely to be more sort of easier to control and in fact more autonomous. So more in line with providing opportunities without being too repressive. So those two polar cases illustrate that there is a different sort of there is a range of different types of state power that can be rooted in different things, rooted in different types of institutions and exercised differently. Now, the rule-based one, I think, is very important. But the reason why I singled out the infrastructural one rather than the rule-based one is that the rule-based one also depends on what the rules are. So I think ultimately what we want, of course, is more rule-based institutions and power of the state. But we also want to make sure that those rules are the right rules. So if you go to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, early 90s, South Africa had a constitution that was broadly obeyed, and many of the courts and state institutions enforced it quite successfully by the standards of many developing countries. But it was based on rules that empowered less than 10% of the population and disempowered completely all of the Black population under apartheid, both politically but also economically, in terms of the education that they obtain, in terms of their right to organize, in terms of their ability to enter into business. So the rules have to be updated in the right way for the right rule-based type of state power to be a tool for further empowerment of the society as well.
Thank you very much. Another question that seems to be common among some of the comments is about inequality. So is inequality in itself a sign, reducing inequality, is that a sign that we're going in, that we are in the corridor? You know, on the other hand, is it something that we should seek no matter what? You know, a bit of a notion of the relationship between this path towards more justice and economic inequality per se.
I think that's a great question, and I think it's a complex question, and I don't think there is a single answer. I think normative issues matter here. My own take, and I try to leave the normative ones as far, but I think we cannot move away from the normative ones completely. But I think the level of inequality matters. How it co-varies with poverty matters. How it co-varies with economic opportunities matters. And what type of social and political implications it has matters. So for instance, if you have a Gini coefficient of 30%, which is, you know, as equal as, you know, the more equal parts of Western Europe, and then you have economic growth, and during this economic growth process, business owners increase their income by 3% and workers increase their income by 2%. That's an increase in inequality, but I think it's not a disaster. But if you have the same thing, but business owners increase their income by 10% and workers reduce their income by 5%, like the figure that I showed from the US, that's also gone on in the UK, in Germany, and in other places, well, that's a big problem, because now you have a very non-shared growth. Some people are benefiting, some people are losing out. Or if you have the same thing and the working classes remain more or less where they are, and there is endemic poverty, that's much more problematic. If you have the same thing, but starting not from a Gini coefficient of 30%, but a Gini coefficient of 60%, like in Brazil, well, that's very problematic, because a Gini coefficient of 60% is very, very unequal. So you're increasing inequality starting from a very highly unequal place. But in my mind, even more important are two other considerations about inequality. Not that those ones I just said are unimportant, they're very, very important, but even more important. One is, what's the social context of inequality? So I think in my mind, inequality in Chile is much more problematic than inequality in Germany. because inequality in Chile is embedded in a social structure that I try to describe as what, at least as I perceive, and I think some Chileans perceive as a two-tiered society, where there's a big social status difference already. And second is the political implications of inequality. So there have been there has been a lot of increase in the top 1% share in Sweden. But I don't see that, we may not like it, but I don't see that as problematic as in the one in the US, because the very rich businessmen in Sweden don't have much of political influence, and the system seems to be quite well functioning in terms of keeping them away from politics. In the US, from Republican supporters to Democrat supporters, all of these big tycoons are so politically influential that it is much more concerning. So these two political and the social legs of inequality are what I think much more corrosive, and the ones where state capacity can be much more effective in dealing with.
Extremely interesting answer. I think we have time for one more, and that's a tough
Sorry,
one.
I've been giving long answers. Apologies.
But what is your preferred structure to generate this Red Queen effect? Now that we're thinking in the Constitution, what ingredients could help this path moving forward, in your opinion?
I think that's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer. But in my mind, I see three elements that need to be emphasized. One is, and perhaps most important, I don't know, is the institutional basis of participation. So, you can have participation that's very ad hoc. People can pour into the streets, they can protest, they can be loud, but unless it's institutionalized, so laws protected, organizations, parties enable it, channel it, mediate it, it's not going to be as effective. Second, free diversity of voices. It can be cacophonous, it can look disorganized, but society's participation needs to be very diverse. So you cannot have true empowerment if you say, okay, we're going to listen to those people who, are in Santiago, but not to the people in the rural areas because they don't know what they want. Or you cannot say, okay, we're going to listen to the well-educated, but the less well-educated, they don't deserve a voice. So that diversity is very important. But third, and perhaps in some tension with the second, at the end of the day, you have to find a way of preventing polarization. So you have to allow the diversity, but then society needs to organize around a set of common principles. And the fact that not everybody will completely buy into those principles can generate polarization, which can then undermine society's own power. So let me say one more word on this, because I think it's relevant in the Chilean context. If you have a process that is fair, free, and broadly agreed, and writes a new constitution, but then if the constitution is legitimate and has the right balance, but then a group says, no, we don't recognize the constitution, and then tries to continuously undermine the constitution, that is what I mean by the polarization that will ultimately really undermine the power of society's potential participation in politics. So I think this last element, that there must be some acceptance of the political processes by both sides, is going to be very important at the end.
Thank you very much for all those thoughts. And I think that you've given us a lot to think about, and how this constitutional process can be done to favor the future of the country. Jose Miguel?
Well, just I want to close. Thank you again, Daron. Thank you so much for this enlightening speech. We have, as Jan said, we have to think about a lot. We're just starting the process, and we're going to start in a few months. The convention will start going to start working on the deep issues of the Constitution. Right now, they have only been talking about rules and how they will work, but now they're going to start discussing
the hard part starts.
The hard parts of the thing. So we will see how this goes along, and hopefully we can talk again next year or so and see how this has gone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
Pleasure
bye.
to be
Thank you very
able to
much
join you
also.
remotely.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.